Hi everyone, today I'm going to be reviewing The Raven Tower by Ann Leckie. Ann Leckie is an author that I discovered pretty recently. I've read the first two books in her science fiction trilogy, The Imperial Raj. I still don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's spelled R-A-D-C-H. The first book is Ancillary Justice, and the second one is Ancillary Sword. I'm still planning to read book 3 pretty soon, but I've read so much science fiction recently and I was feeling kind of sick of it. And her most recent book is a standalone fantasy. It's her first fantasy novel, so I decided to read that this month instead of the third book in the science fiction trilogy to give myself a little bit of a break and because I was curious about it. I was curious to see what her fantasy writing would be like because I found a lot of her science fiction writing to be a little bit complex and hard to get into. I ended up liking it quite a bit, but it was definitely one of those books where you feel very confused at first and you start eventually understanding how things work. The world building is really good though. It definitely feels very alien, and she really represents a lot of things about different cultures and this alien world. I mean, they're human, but the cultures themselves feel very alien to us. So I was really curious to see how that writing style would translate to a fantasy novel. To be perfectly honest, she writes fantasy a lot like she writes science fiction. It is very different than a lot of fantasy out there. And I'm going to give a full disclaimer. I really liked The Raven Tower, but I read it twice. And I read it twice because I didn't really like it the first time. I'll explain more about that a little bit later, but first I'll just talk about the plot. It's a little bit hard to talk about the plot without talking about other aspects of the book because it's written in a very unique way. So there are two main threads to the plot, and the first one is basically a retelling of Hamlet. The story is set in a world that I would describe it as being sort of a lot more of a low technology setting than a lot of the other fantasy that we see these days. There, I think, is some use of metals, but there doesn't seem to be particularly advanced metalworking in these societies. So maybe kind of like a relatively early agricultural society. In this world, people worship a number of different gods. Some of them are more powerful, some of them are smaller, some of them take the form of animals, and others are in objects. The gods gain strength from accepting offerings and sacrifices from the humans, and they have the power to change the world basically by speaking things. Whatever the gods say either has to become true, or if the god is not powerful enough to make it true, or if it's actually impossible, the god will be wounded or even die. The book takes place in the kingdom of Iridan, which worships pretty much only one main god, the Raven. The Raven gives enormous power to the ruler of this kingdom, who is known as the Raven's lease, but in return, when the bird that the raven is inhabiting at the time dies, the lease has to kill himself in order to basically be a sacrifice to the raven, and then his heir will take his place. So at the start of the book, the lease's heir, Lord Mawat, is going back to the capital city because the raven that the god is possessing is dying, and so he knows his father is going to sacrifice himself, and then he's going to end up taking his father's place as the raven's lease. However, like I said, this is basically Hamlet. So when he gets back there, he finds that his father has supposedly fled instead of sacrificing himself like he was supposed to, and his rather villainous uncle has taken his father's place. The main character is not Mawat, though. The main character is actually Mawat's aide, a soldier named Aolo. Aolo has never been to the capital city before. He's from a relatively rural background, but he is very loyal to Mawat, and basically when Mawat throws a Hamlet-sized temper tantrum at having not been able to succeed his father, Aolo starts investigating what is going on in the city because a lot of things about the circumstances seem pretty weird and don't line up. I don't want to give any spoilers, but if you're at all familiar with Hamlet, you probably do have a general sense where all of this is going to eventually lead. Here's the part where it's a little strange and hard to read though. This part of the narrative is actually told in second person. So it is someone who is telling Aolo's own story to him. The narrator of this is actually a god. The god gets its own first-person narrative where we learn about its history pretty much from the beginning of, maybe not time, but at least what the god remembers, up through the arrival of humans and up through the present day. this narrative actually ends up completely lining up with the present day narrative by the end of the book, but it seems quite separate for a lot of the time. So that's why this book is a little bit hard to read, because you have this second person narrative that is covering all the present day events, and then you have this first person narrative that's talking about past events, but from a non-human perspective. So I'm going to admit, the first time I read this book, I was curious to know what was going to happen with the people and the present day narrative, but I didn't feel that interested by the God stuff, and I just didn't pay that much attention and even kind of skimmed through some of those sections, and I wasn't really enjoying the book that much. But then when I got to the end, I actually thought the way it ended was really interesting, and the way the storyline came together was really interesting, and I actually got this really strong feeling that I should read the book again and pay more attention to the other narrative. It's really, really unusual for me to read things back to back. I've never done it before for a book that I wasn't loving. So I don't really know why I decided to do this. I guess I just saw something in the book that made me think I could appreciate it a lot more than I just had, and I just felt really drawn to try again immediately. Normally, the only books that I reread, especially right away, are the books that I just loved so much I didn't want to put them down. And this isn't even how I felt about that book. I don't know. I don't really understand why I made that decision, but I'm really glad I did, because I really did enjoy the book the second time. I thought it was a really great book. So I don't know even how to recommend this book, because I had to read it twice to like it, but I did end up really, really liking it and thinking it was a really well-written, great book. So the second time through, I really liked both narratives. I really loved the book, but it's not the easiest thing to read. I definitely think that if you like really straightforward stories and narratives, this isn't going to be something you would really enjoy. And even if you're just a highly character-driven reader, this also might not be for you, because the characters are complex and well done, but because of this second person narrative, you don't ever really get inside their heads. Like, you don't really ever get to know them, because you're seeing them through the eyes of this God who is not human. So you are understanding them through their actions, and even maybe the God speculates or talks about what they might be thinking, but it's not the same as really being inside a character's head in a traditional narrative. But despite that weirdness, I thought there was something really compelling about the characters and the way that this was done, and I just ended up thinking it was really good. The world also felt very real and very compelling to me. It felt kind of authentic to what that more low technology, more ancient or primitive society would be like. I also got the sense that there was a lot more to this world than we really got to see. It was pretty limited to the scope of the characters, and also this God who is basically a stone and spent most of its existence never moving, and then ended up getting moved a little bit. So we're pretty much contained to this one city for the entire scope of the story. This is a world where human sacrifice still takes place. I mean, it's mostly voluntary, like people are choosing to sacrifice themselves to the gods, and the gods gain power from that. But it's definitely not something we see all the time in fantasy these days. It's also a culture where, for example, there are a lot of superstitions. Like, until very recently in Iridan, twins were routinely exposed at birth and left to die for being unnatural. So you see Aolo reacting to a pair of twins, even though he knows that it's not their fault they're twins and that it's probably fine. He still has this really deep-seated superstition that it's, wrong for there to be twins. I did feel like we got to know Aolo, even though there is this sense of distance due to the second person narrative. Because we don't really get inside his head, it's important for the sake of the narrative that he is a very proactive character, which he is. He's the kind of person who is immediately exploring and doing things and trying to get to the bottom of things. So we get to know him not so much through his thoughts, but through his choices, which is a really interesting way of getting to know a character. He is a character that has a lot of good sense, and other characters clearly come to respect him through the way that he thinks and the choices that he makes. Aolo is transgender, which is not treated like necessarily a big deal, and it's not a big reveal 3/4 of the way through the book like I've seen other books do recently. It's just a part of who he is as a character, and I thought it was really, really well done. Mawat, the prince who has been denied his rightful place, is a lot like Hamlet. He's kind of temperamental and whiny and doesn't take things very well, but you can also see that he has a core of nobility and wanting to do the right thing. He's also just completely certain all the time that he's right and doing the right thing and isn't always great at listening. So it's interesting. He's not the most likable character, but because we're seeing Aolo and Aolo's loyalty to Mawat, we actually feel a lot more sympathetic to Mawat than we would have just based on what's happening in the book, because you can see that there's a long history between these two characters. You can see that Aolo, who is generally a pretty good guy and that everyone seems to like and respect, that he is very loyal to Mawat and he cares about him and wants to be, you know, a good soldier and a good aide to him. So that makes us think that there's obviously, despite the tragedy of what's going on, Mawat is fundamentally an okay person. For the other characters, the uncle is pretty nasty and scheming and a pretty decent villain. But then the other characters, I think we don't get to spend as much time with them, but they do come across as pretty good and three-dimensional, and I liked them as well. Reading this book really made me want to go reread Hamlet or maybe watch a movie version. It's been a while since I did that. And I don't know, it just made me want to go read Hamlet, especially because I don't think any of us are going to be getting to go see actual plays probably anytime soon. My husband and I were actually planning our honeymoon for this summer, you know, before the plague, and we were going to go see some Shakespeare, so we didn't get to do that, but hopefully in the future. So I usually try to say in a review who I think a book would be a good fit for, but with this one, honestly, I don't even know, because it is a pretty unique book and it took me so long, I mean 2 reads, to actually get into it. So it's a little bit hard to say, but I do feel like this book was very rewarding and very well done. I'm not necessarily going to put it on my top of the year list, if that's a thing, because I feel like the differences in the narration meant you just don't connect to the characters as fully as you do if it's not second person or, you know, a different style of writing. And for me, that's really important to love a book. Like, I have to feel the kind of closeness to the characters that we just don't get here. But otherwise, I thought this book was really great and really unique, and I've definitely felt drawn to fantasy books that are a little bit different or special in some way recently. So yeah, I don't know who to recommend this to, but I do recommend checking it out if it sounds interesting to you.